Hello and welcome. Good to have you with us. You're watching ARIRANG News. I'm Laah Hyun-kyung. Another grand jury decision in the U.S. not to indict a white police officer in connection with the killing of an unarmed black man in New York is causing quite a stir. Protesters are furious, especially because the decision follows shortly after the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Missouri. Shin Se-min has our top story.
If you do not remove yourself from the roadway, you will be placed under arrest.
There were 30 arrests in Manhattan throughout night as protesters marched the city, just as others did in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and even in San Francisco.
The system isn't really built to help anybody out. They're not indicting anybody.
People have to know that people care and that it's not okay. And
this after a grand jury in New York announced that it would not be indicting a white NYPD officer in the death of an unarmed black man. The victim, Eric Garner, was stopped by Officer Daniel Pantaleo on suspicion of selling cigarettes illegally on Staten Island in July. In video of the incident, the officer is seen using a chokehold on Garner, a technique forbidden under the NYPD's patrol manual. Minutes later, Garner was dead of a heart attack. The decision in New York comes less than 2 weeks after a grand jury in Ferguson, Missouri decided not to indict Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of an unarmed black teen, Michael Brown. President Obama called for change.
I'm not interested in talk, I'm interested in action, and I am absolutely committed as President of the United States to making sure that we have a country in which everybody believes in the core principle that we are equal under the law.
Just as with the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, the Department of Justice said it plans to open an investigation to determine whether Eric Garner's civil rights were violated. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
The investigation into the latest cyber attack on Sony Pictures is still underway, and at one point there was a claim that the firm was going to officially name North Korea as the hacker, but the studio says it's not going to jump to any conclusions just yet. Kwon So-ah has the latest.
The cyber attack on Sony Pictures has turned into an international case of whodunit, but many accusing fingers have been pointing squarely in North Korea's direction. Raising those suspicions a notch, popular tech blog Recode reported Wednesday that Sony will name North Korea as the source of the hacking attack. Highly destructive malware knocked out the company's computer systems for over a week and leaked a massive amount of data, including a few unreleased movies onto the internet. Citing two sources close to the probe, the blog said details are being finalized and an official announcement will come very soon. But soon after, the Associated Press reported that Sony has not yet reached any conclusions. The news agency says it received a text message from a Sony spokesperson who said the investigation is ongoing and that Recode's report was not accurate. Intrigue abounds about the hacking attack as North Korea sought to stop Sony from releasing its comedy film called The Interview that depicts two American journalists sent to the North to assassinate leader Kim Jong-un. That movie, however, was not one of the 5 DVD screeners leaked online. But a number of security experts doubt the hacker group that identified itself as the Guardians of Peace has something to do with North Korea, despite earlier reports that Korean code was found inside the hacker's malware. Some even speculate the attack may have been carried out by a disgruntled employee. Pyongyang has yet to deny it was behind the attack. The regime has been quoted as saying, "Wait and see to find out." Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
Still, it begs the question just how mighty is North Korea in terms of its hacking capabilities. An American expert says Pyongyang has an army of hackers totaling in the tens of thousands. Some believe cyber defense measures should be included in the Korea-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty. Kim Hyun-bin has more.
Good afternoon, ladies.
Speaking at a cyber defense meeting in Washington, specialist in Northeast Asian affairs at Johns Hopkins University, Alexander Manzarov pointed out that North Korea has continuously enhanced its cyber hacking capabilities over the past decade. He emphasized that Pyongyang is now capable of penetrating both Seoul and Washington's internet networks, with an army of hackers totaling in the thousands.
Now, 10 years later, the South Koreans believe it's almost 6,000, but probably it's twice as much.
In order to better deal with Pyongyang's cyber threats, some experts believe defense measures should be included in the Korea-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty, similar to a NATO agreement that calls for collective defense against cyber attacks.
The NATO member states agreed to that a large-scale cyber attack against a member country could be considered an attack on the entire alliance.
North Korea has also been suspected of taking part in Iran's recent hacking of 50 government and private firms across 16 nations, as Korea was the second most targeted country behind U.S.
Knowing what level of access they have into over 50 different companies around the world tells us what they could do if they wanted to in terms of controlling critical infrastructure, our physical world, transportation, you name it. So
experts say Seoul will need to invest more in upgrade its cyber defense system to the level of Israel's cyber Iron Dome if it wants to become less vulnerable to North Korea's virtual online war. Kim Hyun-bin, ARIRANG News.
Now, will the six-party nuclear disarmament talks resume? That's a question that's been on repeat ever since the talks were suspended back in 2008. South Korea says it is willing to talk again as long as North Korea is serious. Hwang Sung-hee has this next report.
South Korea is ready to return to the six-party nuclear talks. All North Korea has to do is show that it's serious about giving up its nuclear weapons. Following talks with its Russian counterpart in Moscow on Wednesday, South Korea's chief nuclear envoy Hwang Jung-guk said the five parties, including Russia and China, agree on the need for some preconditions for the multilateral dialogue. That, however, doesn't mean the North must take specific steps before returning to the negotiating table. Hwang said that beginning the talks without North Korea showing a sincere attitude about denuclearization would be meaningless. He added Pyongyang must show a willingness to engage in a constructive dialogue. The multilateral denuclearization talks involving the two Koreas, the U.S., China, Japan, and Russia haven't been held since late 2008. But a recent flurry of diplomatic activity among the six parties has fueled hopes of getting the ball rolling again. Washington's new special representative for North Korea policy, Sung Kim, will meet with Hwang in Seoul on Friday as part of a three-nation trip that also takes him to Japan and China. This while North Korean officials and American security experts are reportedly arranging a meeting in Singapore next month. Diplomatic sources say North Korea's chief nuclear negotiator Lee Yong-ho and former U.S. nuclear envoy Stephen Bosworth are among the likely attendees. Hwang Sang-hee, ARIRANG News.
And now on to the joint railway project involving the two Koreas and Russia. As for who will gain majority control over the management of that project, a report out of Seoul says it will be Russia. Citing government officials and industry sources, Yonhap News says Korea would hold a 49% stake, with Russia making up a majority 51%. An official in the South Korean consortium said they were working to make sure that they have at least partial control over the project to ensure stability. The three-way trade deal involves delivering coal from the Russian station of Kasan to the North Korean port city of Najin on a 54-kilometer railway and then to the South Korean port city of Pohang by sea. The South Korean consortium is expected to ink a formal contract with Russia next year. The Bank of Korea released its tentative national income for the third quarter. Today, the rate of increase for Korea's real gross domestic income was at its slowest pace in well over 2 years. Hwang Ji-hye has the details.
The purchasing power of Korea's population is lagging behind the country's economic growth. The Bank of Korea says the national income edged up 0.3% in real terms in the third quarter from the previous one, the slowest pace of expansion in 2.5 years. The central bank attributes the slower growth to worsening trade conditions and a drop in net foreign factor income. This refers to the difference between the amount a country's citizens and companies earn abroad and the total amount foreign citizens and overseas companies earn in that country. Exports also fell more than 2% in the third quarter from a quarter earlier, marking the first drop in a year. Overall economic activities remain on the recovery track as the country's gross domestic product grew 0.9% in the July to September period from the previous quarter. The third quarter figure matches an estimate made in late October and the roughly 1% growth posted a year earlier. It also marks an improvement from 0.5% growth in the second quarter. From a year earlier, however, Korean economy grew 3.2% in the last quarter, slowing from 3.5% growth in the second quarter. Key indicators also point to a still sluggish economy, with facility investments down 0.5% on quarter compared with a 1.1% rise 3 months earlier. Hwang Ji-hye, ARIRANG News.
So right now, Korea might not be facing the best trade conditions, but what about next year? At least 3 free trade agreements are expected to take effect in 2015, and with that, a local institute says next year is going to be a banner year for Korean exports. Kim Ji-yeon has our next story.
The Institute for International Trade says Korean exports are expected to exceed an all-time high of $600 billion next year, a 4% increase from this year. This is due to improved trade conditions and more working days. And in particular, the agency projects automobile exports to increase by nearly 4% to $51.5 billion, as free trade agreements with Colombia, Australia, and Canada are expected to take effect. Export of semiconductors are forecast to grow by 6% for similar reasons. On the other hand, the agency says increased competition from China will lead to a drop in exports of telecommunications products by nearly 5% to $27.7 billion. This comes amidst slowing Korean exports to China, which have been affected by more Chinese companies like Xiaomi releasing cheaper goods.
Another big factor is slow growth in China, which is in the low 7% range. This, coupled with a U.S. interest rate hike and the weakening of the Japanese yen, may exert pressure on Korean exporters in the latter part of 2015.
The researcher adds it's imperative that the Korean government continue its deregulation drive to remove barriers that local companies face when trying to increase their competitiveness in the global market. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
Korea's ambitious plans to launch a lunar probe in the year 2020 may have to wait a little longer. Why? Because the Parliamentary Budget Committee failed to reflect some $40 million that was supposed to be funneled into the first stages of a moon exploration project in next year's budget. So the plan to launch a test orbiter in 2017 and land a homegrown probe on the moon in 2020 are almost certain to be postponed. It's estimated that more than $600 million will be needed to fund the entire lunar project. Korea's National Commission on Space will begin reviewing and revising its plans next week. Korea and Japan both have chronically low birth rates. Encouraging people to tie the knot has long been viewed as a logical solution because having children out of wedlock is still considered taboo in both countries. But as our Kim Min-ji reports, the way Koreans and Japanese people view marriage are a little different. Take a look.
An aging population and low birth rate, two problems that Korea and Japan have in common and are trying to solve. And since having children out of wedlock is considered socially unacceptable in either country, the focus is on encouraging people to get married. So the countries share similar problems, but do the people of Korea and Japan share similar views on marriage? A report by the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs says no. In surveys on over 10,000 single men and women from Japan between the ages of 18 and 49 and 1,500 Koreans in the same age group, more than 80% of Korean men said marriage comes with benefits, while just about 60% of Japanese men agreed. As for women, roughly 7 in 10 from both countries said marriage was beneficial. Their reasons? Koreans were more based on emotion. The number one reason given was knowing they could rely on their spouse for emotional support. Being allowed to live with their loved one came next on the list. The Japanese respondents, on the other hand, tended to be more practical, with the number one reason being to have children. This was trailed by emotional support and fulfilling the expectations of their parents and relatives. But, as we all know, marriage comes after dating. But Japanese men seem to be more reluctant about dating than Korean men. Nearly 3/4 of Japanese men who took the survey said they were not in a relationship, in comparison with 66% of Korean men. The report says all this stems from Japan's prolonged economic slump, which has changed their spending patterns, making them focus more on their own life rather than a relationship. However, it warns that Korea is no exception to the situation, given its slow economic growth, and call for efforts to reduce the burdens on young people that keep them from tying the knot. Kim Min-ji, ARIRANG NEWS.
All right, last-minute changes or touches are being put on a plant in Korea's southern port city of Busan, which in less than a month will provide almost 50,000 tons of drinking water for the city every day. And the interesting part is that that drinking water will come from the sea. For more on the nation's first desalination plant, here's our Connie Lee.
It's this seawater surrounding Korea's southern coast that's being turned into fresh, drinkable water. Korea now has its very first desalination plant built and ready to go for full operation starting in January. Located in the southern port city of Busan, the $175 million plant can pump in about 100,000 tons of water per day from the ocean and remove the salt and turn it into 45,000 tons of fresh water, enough for about 150,000 residents in the city. This high-tech facility was built by Korea's very own Tusan Heavy Industries and Construction, currently the #1 leader in the desalination plant market.
Our company has been building these plants and working on desalination technology for about 40 years now. We built this one to help expand our overseas market and prepare for future water shortages.
The purified water has been certified as safe to drink by the Busan Water Authority, and the cost for consumers will be the same as fresh water from other sources. So is Korea facing a water shortage? Well, not right now, but potentially yes. According to a recent UN report, by the year 2030, nearly half of the global population will face water shortages due to demand exceeding water supply.
The world is headed towards water shortages. Desalination plants are one way to fight water scarcity. And in the past 2 to 3 years, the number of these plants has grown tenfold.
There are currently more than 16,000 desalination plants worldwide. And in the face of water scarcity, that number is expected to increase in the years to come. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News, Busan.
2014 is on track to be the hottest year on record, according to the UN Weather Agency. The World Meteorological Organization said the global average temperature in this year's first 10 months was the same as the record hot year of 2010 at 0.57 Celsius above the average. It said ocean temperatures set a new record, while land temperatures clocked in at the fourth or fifth highest on record. While countries like the U.S. and Canada were struck with early winter-like conditions, countries in the southern hemisphere such as Australia, Argentina, and South Africa were hit with the heat waves. In other news, known as the painter of bottles, Italian painter Giorgio Morandi is considered one of the greatest masters of the still life, but he is not as well known in Korea. Well, the first Morandi exhibition in Korea has opened with hopes of changing exactly that. Im Yoon-hee brings us this report.
Nothing big, nothing fancy. Just ordinary objects, tidy lines, and delicate tones. At first glance, they appear to be just your everyday bottles, and more bottles. These are the subtle works of Italian painter Giorgio Morandi, a painter most famous for his still lifes.
Morandi was born in Bologna, where he lived a very quiet life, never getting married or having any children. He worked and lived in the same studio until the end. But this artist actually lived through multiple wars and chaos, yet he still held true to himself, consistently creating his landscapes and still lifes. Like a chessboard, he would paint the same frame over and over again, moving around objects to find out where each belonged.
Korea and Italy have had ties for 130 years now, and the works of one of Italy's most famous contemporary painters can now be found in Seoul. Most of his works were done on a small scale, and often contained the images of ordinary objects found in life. One of these objects was the everyday, simple glass bottle, but occasionally it would be the common seashell. And sometimes he even ventured to the serene landscape. And while his still lifes were the most successful of his collection, his other works also contain his drastic contrasts of light and geometric shapes that echo the rhythm of his subtle style. Korean artists from more recent times also demonstrate stylistic traits similar to Morandi, implying the timelessness of Morandi's works, and how these traits have just as much meaning today as they had when they were first painted. Some have recreated that familiar silhouette of a bottle or a vase, while some have taken the vase off the canvas in a rather unique homage to the painter.
Morandi was a very quiet artist, but his work still had strong energy. I wanted to create a sculpture with similar traits as Morandi, so I too took traditional everyday objects and shapes, but I used the canvas to actually make the frames, and instead of a paintbrush, I used a needle to create my work. Individually, they are still life objects, but displayed together like this, it almost looks like a still life painting.
Whether it be hung on today's museum wall or a wall 50 years ago, Morandi found a way to create ageless works, paintings that take the everyday objects of life and immortalize them. Im Yoon-hee, ARIRANG News.
One thing, it's bright and sunny here in the capital, but still cold. I'm Michelle Park here with the latest weather forecast. It was a typical cold winter morning and with negative readings, but with the sun out and the winds calmer than yesterday, temperatures have risen about 4 degrees and it's looking like they'll continue to go up throughout today. And the skies are looking very clear today, but due to the high pressure front. But looking at here, clouds are moving in, which will drop down some fresh snow into the evening hours. Now, most of it is going to fall on Jeju's mountains, which will get up to 15 centimeters, while the western coastal areas and nearby regions such as Chungcheondo and both Gyeongsang-do provinces will get up to 7 centimeters. And to our readings for today, Seoul will peak at -1 degrees this afternoon. Meanwhile, southern cities such as Gwangju and Busan will be a bit higher at 4 and 7 degrees. And to other regions, Jeju-hwan peaks at 8, while Dokdo hits low at 3, while Gangneung be very, very low and cold at -11 degrees. Well, that's all for now, Michelle Park. Now here's a look at the weather conditions around the world. And that's it from us at this hour. I'm Laah Hyun-kyung. From me and the rest of the teams, thanks for staying with us. More news coming up at 6 p.m. Korea time.